Hello everyone and welcome back to deucescrack.com. This is Andrew BalugaWhale Sideman back with with a brand new series that we're calling Good Bluff, Bad Bluff. And the purpose of this series is basically to go through a lot of sort of common bluffing situations using some real hands and um, deciding kind of what makes up a good bluff, what makes up a bad bluff, what are some things we need to consider when deciding when to bluff. Now, for most people playing small stakes, to sort of, I guess, preface this before we dive in, um, bluffing is sort of not the ideal exploitative response to most of your opponent's kind of natural strategies. So if you're playing in a game where lots and lots of people don't really like to fold very much, then it might make sort of intuitive sense that bluffing might not be so good. But that's going to actually sometimes run at odds to what we're told. Things like c-betting is good, where most of the time we find ourselves when we're c-betting, we're bluffing. But I oftentimes, when I'm working with people, poker students and things like that, I often see people not really understanding why they're betting in lots of cases, and most of the time that those spots where they're confused about why they're betting are bluffs. So today, actually, we're not going to go through and actually go over like a bunch of or any really like specific hands today. That's going to be the future sessions. We'll have that. Today, we're going to go through and come up with a really or as well defined as we can definition of what bluffing actually is, or what like the words themselves actually mean, and we'll sort of find some interesting things. We can sort of talk about the evolution of how people have thought about bluffing. So with that in mind, here we go. So the first thing that we'll decide about, or we're going to talk about with bluffing, is the fundamental theorem of poker, which I've gotten written down here. I'll just repeat it so that you guys, if you're listening to the audio, you can hear that as well. It's from David Sklansky's The Theory of Poker, which in general is quite a good book, and certainly was a book that was ahead of its time in terms of advancing poker theory much farther than where it was before. But this is sort of the main fundamental theory of poker that he has, which is this. Every time you would play a hand differently from the way you would have played it if you could see all of your opponent's cards, they gain. And every time you play your hand the same way you would have played it if you could see all their cards, they lose. Conversely, every time opponents play their hand differently from the way they would have played if they could see all your cards, you gain. And every time they play their hands the same way they would have played if you could see all your cards, you lose. So the basic idea, to sort of, I guess, paraphrase that, would be if you knew what your opponents had, you would never make any wrong choices about like whether or not you thought you were ahead or behind, and so you'd play. So in theory, you'd play perfectly. And by the same token, every time you play as if you couldn't see their cards, you lose, and vice versa. This is wrong. It seems like it would be right, kind of naturally, and when I first read it, I assumed it was right. But it actually is missing kind of one big piece, which is that there are two major questions in poker. It's not just what do they have, but it's also what will they do with what they have. So let's consider this. So as I said, it's not just about what he has, it's about what he'll do. So this is where sort of we developed this idea, like this sort of what I call the classic definition of bluffing, which we'll get to in a second. But you can imagine this. When you first started, like when you first play against, or like whenever you play against like a weak player, like a bad passive player or something like that, there's this really common tendency to say, my opponent's cards are so weak, he can't possibly call me because his cards are so weak. I'm sure everyone here has been down that road before, where you correctly identify that your opponent has a ton of combos of bottom pair and a bunch of combos of maybe ace high, and the flush got there, and there's no way he can call because of these things, and then he ends up calling you anyway. And I can recall like one specific hand where I like three barreled on a, let's see, I want to say it was a 9-7-4 queen king board, where I barreled through and I got called by Jack 4. And I was like, this guy's like just a big bad pacifist. Like, I'm sure he'll fold all these things to me. And I was correct about what he had, but I was incorrect about what he'll do. So from David Sklansky's point of view, um, we might say that, okay, well, if I know that he has a pair of fours, I should never put any money into the pot at all. But that's actually not true if I think that he actually will fold a pair of fours. Then, even though I, in theory, would be playing perfectly if I did not bet against him, I'm playing even better than David Sklansky's version of perfect if I can actually get him to fold those things. So this is where we sort of broke down this sort of so-called classic definition of bluffing, which is to say that a bluff is a bet to cause better hands to fold. So if we can see this, we can see sort of the better hands part is referring to what he has, and the folding part is referring to what he will do. If we just say that, like, my bluff is to make him fold, sometimes he may fold things that we don't really want him to fold, or sometimes he may not have things that we expect him to fold at all. If you expect your opponent to only have strong top pairs and he's like bad passive or something like that, we may say that even though we might be betting to get him to fold, he's not actually going to do that. And by the same token, if we don't think about like what hands he might have, and we just say like, oh, I'm gonna try to get him to fold things, fold whatever, but he's the kind of person who won't fold like bottom pair or anything like that, then even though we might be able to say, okay, he has some of these things that we think we can get him to fold, this sort of second piece of the puzzle, what he'll do, doesn't actually work out. So that was like what we rolled with for quite a long time, as this is like the definition of bluffing. But we found there were many of these other cases that didn't quite fit into this that became problematic for us. So here are some examples of the classic definition of bluffing. You hold 3-deuce offsuit and raise on the button. Now this is not an endorsement for saying you should raise 3-deuce offsuit on the button. This is just an example. And your raise causes your opponent in the big blind to fold 4-deuce offsuit. Now, this is sort of direct one-to-one situation. In fact, if your opponent folds anything when you raise 3-deuce offsuit, they are playing incorrectly against your hand because you have not low. You have the worst possible hand. Okay, another example of this would be if you, let's say, missed your flush draw and were able to bet and cause your opponent to fold bottom pair. Both of these spots are kind of very, very direct. And in fact, on the river, most of the time that you bluff the river, you're bluffing for this so-called classic reason, because there's no more equity anymore. You are just trying to get your opponent to fold better hands than you because you can't really get lucky on any later streets. So the classic definition, short, sweet, beautiful, the direct inverse of the value definition that we've been using for a very long time now, which is betting to get your opponents to call with worse hands. Now we're trying to bet to get our opponents to fold better hands. It all seems so sweet and wonderful and like a perfect description of the poker universe, except for the fact that it's not quite complete. So let's see here. So we run into problems, which is basically that if we're going to go back to the definition of saying we want to get the classic definition of we want to get our opponent to fold better hands, that runs into the problems where sometimes we want our opponents to fold worse hands. So I'll give you an example that I use all the time when I'm talking to poker students, which is to say, let's say that we're playing heads up, and it's 100 big blinds, and you raise on the button with pocket 8s, and I 3-bet, and you 4-bet, and I click it back 5-bet, and you jam. And while I'm thinking about what I'm going to do, I turn my hand face up, and I have ace-queen, which is, I'm not sure if I'm going to call it or not. I haven't decided yet. Now, despite the fact that pocket 8s has greater equity than ace-queen, you actually make more money when I fold. In a sense, I'm making a correct decision if I decide to call, but even though you're plus EV in both cases, you're plus greater EV in the case that I make an incorrect fold. So, this is just one of the many examples of when we actually might bluff with the expectation of getting worse hands to fold. So, reason number one, we say if our opponent has a worse hand, but he has odds to call. If he folds that counts as a mistake, and that counts as a bluff for us. So that would be our pocket eights versus ace queen example. Ace queen is a worse hand, but has the correct odds it needs to call. Another one would be if our opponent doesn't bet or call, basically doesn't put any money in the pot at all, without making the best hand. This is one that can be a little bit tricky to wrap our heads around. But you could imagine, we'll go over some cases in a minute with this. And then a third example of this would be if our opponent were to play correctly if we don't bluff, but incorrectly if we do bluff. And that one is the trickiest by far. And there are probably some other times as well where we might want worse hands to fold that I haven't wrapped up into here yet. Maybe, bluffing tends to be quite a wide, give you quite a large number of opportunities. But anyway, so the semantic problem is that in the classic definition, we are only focused on getting him to fold better hands, but now we're trying to get him to fold worse hands too sometimes, and so we'll sort of rephrase it as we want to get our opponent to fold hands as a mistake. But that's kind of broad and feels like kind of a cop-out, so we kind of need to understand what mistakes our opponent actually might be making in order to do this. But before we go on, I should have put this maybe even a little bit earlier in the presentation, but I want to make a quick interjection and say that for now, we're going to discuss just hands and not ranges. In the future, we will need to discuss about ranges and not hands, but as sort of we're wrapping our head around what types of mistakes our opponents might make, it's going to be easier for us to start off thinking about them in terms of just hand versus hand. And then as we get farther down this rabbit hole, we'll start discussing these things in terms of range versus range. Which, again, the same basic principles will apply when thinking range versus range, but it's a little bit harder to wrap our heads around all that at once. So let's make sure we put our feet one step in front of the next. Okay. So, here's some examples of spots where we might want our opponent to fold, or some examples where our opponent makes a mistake by folding even though he has odds. This is probably one of the most common spots where bluffing is effective, which is to say, little edges where your opponent, if they knew exactly what you were doing, they would, the correct adjustment would be to play more aggressively in some case. So, or I guess I should say to fold less. So the first example is that we raise for min raise the 2 big blinds on the button with king 8 offsuit, and our opponent folds with 9-6 offsuit in the big blind. Now, if you were to pull up Poker Stove, which I pulled up a second ago and then I have accidentally erased. Let's see if I can bring it up. If you pull up Poker Stove, you'll find that the equity of something like king 8 offsuit against something like 9-6 offsuit certainly prices in the 9-6 offsuit to go ahead and make a call pre-flop if they were just going to be playing, if it was like, if that was the end of the hand, for example, that would be that. So we can see here that if we put in a combo of king 8 against a combo of 9-6, 9-6 is going to win about 39% of the time, which means that against the min raise, getting 2.5 to 1, getting 3.5 to 1. You're definitely priced in to go ahead and make your call. But most people there are folding. And again, this is going to be related to ranges as we get a little bit deeper into it. But for now, we could view that as a mistake by our opponent with 9-6 offsuit to fold against king 8 offsuit, because he's getting the pot odds he needs to continue and try to make a 9 or a 6 or to play poker against us in some way. So oftentimes when we're raising before the flop with kind of our bluffing range, we're kind of relying on our opponent folding too much when he has odds to continue. Now, granted, there are later streets and there's lots of other stuff, that's going to happen, and also ranges exist. And while he might be, at 39% against a hand like king 8 offsuit, as you can see here, he is at 16% against pocket aces. That's a pretty bad situation to be in. Even if we were to give him something like ace king, it's not great either. Where he's still like only at 35% equity. No, actually, even against ace king, it looks like for a min open, he might be justified in calling there if he didn't make mistakes post flop, which is again a little bit challenging to do when the board comes down something like ace king 7. Or excuse me, king 9-7, and sort of becomes tempting to make some maybe bad calls or something like that. Anyway, so that's the first example of sometime that someone might fold with correct odds but make a mistake by folding, so making our bluff effective. Another one would be we c-bet a hand like pocket fours on an ace 8-5 board, and our opponent folds jack 10. So if we pull out these, if we do this sort of thing again, where we have 4-4 on the one hand and jack 10 off on the other hand, and we make a board look something like ace 8-5, we end up with jack 10 having about 32% equity against pocket fours on this type of board. So if he is folding that for a half pot bet, so he's getting 3-1, which means he only in theory needs to have 25% odds. Now again, there is also another difference between your pot equity and your EV. So it may be very plausible that his EV might be negative against a range. But in this very, very specific and constrained example, you might imagine that your opponent, if you knew you had pocket fours, at the very least would want to call the half pot bet just to try to make a better hand than you, because he's getting the odds to try to do that. Now, granted, that implies he sees two streets and that you're not barreling the turn, but let's just say hypothetically that you never barrel the turn with pocket fours on this ace 8-5 board, and so when your opponent does call this, he gets to see two free cards and try to hit his hand and make a better hand. Again, you can quickly see how complicated this can get in a hurry, which is kind of why I'm trying to, for the time being right now, make this as simple as possible. The last example of this, of somebody folding incorrectly due to their odds, is we bet a pot-sized bet with pocket tens, leaving us about 80 big blinds behind on a 10-9, 4-3 board, and our opponent folds 8-7 suited. Now, if he knew specifically that we had pocket tens, he'd be pretty likely to have the implied odds to win a whole stack if, let's say, he hits a 6, certainly if he hits a 6, and very plausibly if he hits a jack also. So it's if he knew that he had that kind of implied odds, he would definitely be getting the odds he needed to continue against our hand. And it feels a little bit strange to bluff with a hand like pocket 10, like to bluff with the nuts, on a spot like this. But in a sense, when playing against 8-7 suited, while we would be sort of, if we could play perfectly and we knew that what they had and everything, obviously we'd want them to call the turn, and then we'd want to be able to like check fold on rivers and stuff like that. But in truth, like check fold on like, a 6 or a jack river. But in truth, we're probably just getting stacked on a 6 or a jack river against the range in general. So if we actually, it's kind of crazy to think about, but if we actually, think about what types of hands we're betting against in his range, we actually don't really mind if he folds 8-7 suited on the turn, to be totally honest. If we make an accurate guess as to what his implied odds actually look like when, dealing with the nuts here on a dry board, if we would assume that he stacks us every time that he calls 8-7 suited because he'd also play the same way with pocket fours, pocket threes, pocket nines, then in that event we don't really we can't fold the river, which makes his call on the turn plus EV. So in that sense, we probably get more, we get more money when he folds 8-7 suited on the turn instead. So again, weird to think about bluffing with the nuts, but true against this sort of hand in the sense of, not the classic sense, because we have the nuts, we can't get him to fold any kind of better hands, but we can get him to fold hands incorrectly due to his odds. Now the first two examples are really tied to the direct odds. So what are my odds pre-flop? I'm getting 3.5 to 1. What are my odds on the flop? I'm getting 3 to 1. But what are my odds? What are my odds plus implied odds is another important factor. Okay. So those are some examples of sometimes that your opponent might make mistakes by folding too often with odds. Let's proceed. So the next one you hear people talk about a lot is what we can sort of think about as protection. But the basic idea of this is that our opponent doesn't bet or raise or call a bet without making a hand that's better than ours. So in this sense, we are betting to protect ourselves from our opponent making a better hand. Now, there's a lot of clauses in here that we should sort of make sure we break down effectively and completely. So the first one is that our opponent is not going to bet or call without making the best hand. So an example of this would be of a spot where our opponent might bet or call without making the best hand would be this. Let's say that we have pocket kings and we raise, and our opponent calls, and the board comes down. Let's use pocket queens since this is our first example. And the board comes down ace 3 8, and our opponent has pocket fours. Well, if we thought that our opponent would, let's say, call a bet, if we bet on the flop, we should bet for value, or would be inclined to bet for value. And if we were to say that, like, maybe we'd even say that if we bet the flop, he might fold this pocket fours, but if we check back, he might call a bet on a later street. So let's just assume that we're going to check pocket queens on this board for a second and say, okay, if we're playing against an opponent who might bet, we would be happy to check and call because, see, this person is going to bet without making the best hand. If we were to check back and our opponent were to check the turn but then call a bet, then we'd still be inclined to check back, assuming he wouldn't have called a bet on the flop. Because, again, this premise here is that our opponent would not bet or call without making the best hand. But to make this, I guess, as complete as we possibly can, if our opponent never bets as a bluff and never calls a bet, he only puts money in once he makes a 4, when he hits a 2-outer or something like that, then checking is a less EV option with our hand against his hand than just betting ourselves. And that should be kind of intuitive. But essentially, if he folds pocket fours always to a bet, then betting wins the pot. But if we check, he folds, basically we win the pot minus whatever portion of the time he hits a 4 times however much money he actually makes from us when he does hit a 4. Because assuming, let's say, the turn card's a 4 and he bets, if we think that he is passive, or if we think he might bluff that, we might call. But the same token, if he checks the turn, he might trap us into betting for value and check raising or something like that. So anyway, this is a somewhat common spot where we actually have an inclination to bet and get our opponent to fold worse hands that don't have odds, but they do have some element of equity because they are never, ever, ever going to actually put money in the pot without making a better hand than you. This is a spot that is a lot more common in small stakes games than in higher stakes games, but in small stakes games, it's really worth paying attention to, because if you're playing against passive opposition, this is one of the reasons why c-betting is so effective. In higher stakes games, you oftentimes are inclined to check back, to do a so-called like pot control, to kind of manage the pot in such a way that that you can induce bluffs from your opponent, that you can keep your opponent's range wide, so that you can do all these things that apply against a person who is likely to run bluffs against you or to put money in the pot without making the nut type of hand. Whereas against passive opposition, checking back in a lot of cases, or like not c-betting in a lot of cases, is only really giving your opponent the opportunity to suck out and hit a better hand than you. Now, granted, this goes both ways, where if you check back, if your opponent has an ace, you get a chance to suck out against him. But in general, especially in spots where your opponent has a lot of things that are not aces, that may have equity, you're probably better off going ahead and just betting. So, like, a good example of this, even better example against a passive opponent, would be something like having pocket nines on this ace 8-3 board. If your opponent folds pocket fours, that's great. And if he folds queen jack, that's great. Now, granted, he might have odds with queen jack to call, so this might not be entirely in this realm. But these things are not, I guess I should go back for a second here. These three reasons that I've listed here, if our opponent has a worse hand but odds to call, if our opponent doesn't bet or call without making the best hand, or if our opponent plays correctly against a check but incorrectly against a bet, these things can all like work together. They're not mutually exclusive. So in this example, for a second, if we have pocket nines on an ace 3-8 board, if our opponent has queen jack, he may have odds to call, but he might fold as a mistake there. He also might make the mistake if our opponent, like, basically isn't going to bluff, if we check back pocket nines on that board, if our opponent isn't going to bluff with queen jack, then again, we're just giving him a walk to his equity, which is a mistake on our end also. It's another spot we'd want our opponent to fold a worse hand. So those things can work together. Okay. The next example that we have here is pocket sixes, where we're on the button on a 10-5-3 board, and we have called a pre-flop raise. So let's say a person raises in mid position, and we call with pocket sixes on the button, and the flop comes down 10-5-3 rainbow, and he checks. Now, if you have like certain times you might have reads where somebody might be like, check calling with a wide range of strong hands there or something like that. But most of the time when someone checks after being a pre-flop raiser without a read, they're either giving up or they've got something like ace king or ace queen that they're going to call like a bet or something like that. But let's give our opponent something like king queen, for example, for a second. If our opponent did indeed decide to give up, if he is done, then even though we can't get called by worse hands, or he won't call us with king queen, and he won't like, let's say he won't bet if we check back, like he won't bluff. And he won't let me see if I can phrase this over because I sort of lost my train of thought. He won't call with king queen on the one hand. So we would first of all think, well, I can't really bet for value, and he's not going to fold like pocket eights, so our classic definition of bluffing seems no good. And so we kind of get lost in this space where, like, do we want him to fold this worse hand? And assuming that he won't bet or he won't call later on with just king high, then indeed we should definitely bet to try to get him to fold king queen. So this is the one that looks kind of the most like protection. But the problem that people get with protection is they assume that protection is something that comes along with value. Like our pocket tens hand, for example, betting for protection. If we go back to this other one here on this other board, betting to try to get him to fold the nuts, like here would like seem like protection. But really, like, protection is a facet of bluffing. Like, it's hard to imagine ourselves bluffing with the nuts in this spot, but that is indeed what we're doing. And in a sense here, we're also kind of bluffing with what you might even imagine to be like a relatively nut-ish hand, given that our opponent is like really often check folding. And so we have the best hand like a huge portion of the time. It's kind of funny to think about like our opponent here having like really, really good odds, like to, probably like wins the pot. Probably should figure that out exactly before I just say it. But let's just put this into stove for a second and see what happens on a 10-9-4-3 board. Gotta put in suits. And what's the last one? Hearts. Cool. So here you might say that our opponent has like 18% equity with pocket tens. So getting our opponent to fold that like correctly, or fold that incorrectly might be kind of useful. Whereas over here with pocket sixes on this 10-5-3 board, pocket sixes on this 10-5-3 board against king queen. Let's kind of take a look at what this looks like. He's got more equity with pocket sixes there, but it's kind of amusing to think of like pocket sixes and pocket tens, their relative value, both kind of relying on getting our opponent to fold pieces of equity of the pot incorrectly. So yeah, I mean, it looks to me here like before we even get into, actually we can talk about this for a second. So it's sort of, you see another opportunity here for us to essentially bet for quote-unquote protection, but we're really bluffing. Now you might go ahead and say this. If our opponent has 28% equity in the pot here with king-queen, and we have, obviously the inverse of that, 72. If we were to bet, like make a pot-sized bet, for example, where our opponent was getting 2-1 odds, he would not be getting odds to call. So if he did call, he'd be calling incorrectly. However, if we were to bet, let's say, or half the pot, use as an example, where our opponent is now getting like 3-1 to call, he actually is getting odds to call against our hand. So if we're going hand versus hand, betting half pot here is more likely to make him make a truly theoretic mistake by calling when he has odds than betting full pot would be, even though like it's also a mistake for him to call, it's also a mistake for him to for us to not bet if he's giving up with king queen. Anyway, I realize this is getting like a tongue twister for a second, so we'll kind of move on and get back to some of these things in a bit. The next example here is we get pocket kings, and we 3-bet, and someone 4-bets with ace-4 offsuit. And the question would be whether or not we're supposed to shove all in with pocket kings before the flop in this case, or whether or not we're supposed to just flat call against him. Now, if our opponent was likely to, let's say, c-bet the flop, if he misses, so if the board comes down, let's say queen 5-7, does he c-bet the flop? Or if he was likely to stack off if the board came down something like 7-6-3, where he makes a gutter and an overcard or something like that, then we might be inclined to just flat against somebody like this. However, if our opponent does not c-bet very often, flatting here becomes a big problem because we give our opponent kind of a walk to the flop to have a good chance of hitting an ace. Obviously, if the ace comes down on the flop like 18% of the time, something like that. So that's a pretty big piece of this already quite large pot to give if we don't get anything in return for it. Now, if we get something in return for it, then flatting is almost certainly going to be better. But we have to kind of be conscious of this when we are deciding whether or not we want to actually ship preflop or try to trap and slow play. What is our opponent going to do? And again, at small stakes games where people are not very aggressive, you're often, I mean, in this case, the person kind of has to be aggressive because they're 4-betting with ace-4 offsuit. But like in small stakes games, we often want to just get stuff in because our opponents we're not likely to induce much action against bluffs as we go. Okay, now let's get to the really, really tricky one, which is I've only even given us one example here. Which is that what happens when we want to bet when our opponent will play incorrectly against a bet, but correctly against a check. So this one is very tricky. We have queen jack on an ace 8-5 board, and our opponent folds jack 10. We bet it, and he folds. Now this would seem to be, right off the bat, like the least big mistake by our opponent, because he has a pretty dominated hand, his equity is really poor, and he doesn't really have any strong back doors or anything like that, and so he is what seems to be playing this hand like pretty well to fold this. However, we could envision that if he knew what we had, but we didn't know what he had, if we bet queen jack and he raised the flop, for example, we would almost certainly fold. If we bet queen jack and he floated the flop, unless we got like a pretty lucky turn card, he would be likely to win the pot by let's assume the jack 10 player is in position, that he'd be relatively capable of winning the pot pretty often like that. So in a sense, if we are bluffing and our opponent misses out on an opportunity to rebluff us, he is there then making a mistake from a theoretic point of view. By the same token, let's say, for example, that we decided that we were going to give up with queen jack and say, this ace 8-5 board is not a good board to c-bet, like I'm just going to check fold, and our opponent goes ahead and then bets jack 10 because we've checked and correctly gets us to fold queen jack, then he has basically played correctly against the check, but incorrectly against our bet if he folded. So this is one of those spots where people often say, well, I wanted to bluff him so that he wouldn't get a chance to bluff me. Now, there's more than one defense to being afraid of getting bluffed too often, which is like, in theory, if you thought your opponent's going to bluff all combos of jack 10, you might get away with like check calling queen jack, which might be the most exploitative version of this. But if, for example, you think that your opponent's betting range is like too heavily weighted towards like strong hands to go ahead and continue here, again, this is where we have to sort of start thinking range versus range, that we might actually be able to say that I can bluff queen jack on the ace 8-5 board, but that I can but that bluffing ace queen jack is better than check calling queen jack is better than check folding queen jack. You could say that. You could say any sort of combination of those three things. But the point of the matter is that if your opponent is, let's say, missing out on an opportunity to re-bluff you, that also counts as a mistake. So there are quite a number of different ways that your opponent, that this one can kind of wrap in. It's very, very tricky. We will see some of these things as we go throughout the course of this season. More different types of bluff opportunity types of things. Okay. Now, this is kind of our last slide for the day, but it's really, really important. Um, so what I have here is a graph that on the x-axis we have hands by percent. So, this is like 100% of hands. So this would be like 70, so obviously down here on the bottom right. And we have at the very, very top of this curve, this is pocket aces. The y-axis over here is what I'm just calling value in quotation marks. In theory, this is actually like total like lifetime earnings of these hands would sort of look something like this. There's a reason why I want to put it this way. Value's definition is extremely clear and concise. You're betting to get your opponent to call you or raise you with a worse hand. Basically, your opponent has to continue with a worse hand. However, a lot of people start to wrap up things like Queen Jack into value because they expect their opponent to call with things like Jack 10. Now that's true, but if your opponent also calls with many combos of Ace X and King X, suddenly Queen Jack's value is actually not so valuable. It's kind of in the middle with this what I have labeled as everything else here. So what we find is that there aren't that many opportunities to truly value bet before the flop. Probably somewhere between like 5 and 7 or 5 and 8% of hands you could really count as like very heavily on the value side. But even within those, aces are so far beyond everything else, and like aces through queens, for example, are so far above everything else that most of the value is actually coming from when you have these really, really premium nut hands, and that the rest of the like so-called value isn't necessarily from value betting according to our definition of it, but it's a lot more coming from our ability to bluff with equity, and bluff in the sort of ways that we've described in this presentation today. But what you will find is that if we're operating hands by percentage, that a very small percent of hands over here, I think we said 5 to 8 a second ago, are truly in the value betting territory, which means that everything else, the remaining 92 to 95% of hands, are in the potential bluff zone. Now, if we go back here a few slides, we see that there are quite a number of ways that we can get our opponent, or that we can justify bluffing. So we have this classic definition of bluffing: he'll fold better hands. We have this, our opponent will fold even though he has a worse hand, but with odds. Our opponent will fold with worse hands even though, because he won't bet anymore. Our opponent will fold with worse hands because, which is better because he, would have otherwise won the pot if we didn't get him to fold those worse hands. So what we find is that in the grand scheme of everything, we can justify to ourselves like 1,000 different times to bluff. Now, the problem with this is that there are some strategic adjustments that our opponents can make, or sometimes our opponents might already be adjusted to this. In the case of bad passive opponents who are just calling way too much already, that even though you might find a lot of opportunities to bluff, they might not actually be very good because your opponents just might not be folding very often. By the same token, if you're playing against, let's say, a regular or a nit or something like that, at the beginning, taking all those bluff opportunities might seem very good, but it's not a very difficult place for them to sort of counter adjust and play sort of correctly against somebody who bluffs too much. So this is a problem that I end up working on a lot with sort of more advanced players, which is managing that bluff frequency. How do you make sure that when you are bluffing, that you're not you're basically doing it too often, because you have like 9 times out of 10 is a bluff opportunity, whereas only 1 time out of 10 is a value betting opportunity. Now, there are so many opportunities that are good to bluff that you obviously don't want to be bluffing just like exactly half the time. There's probably spots where you'd be bluffing, or relatively on a strategic level, relatively common to be bluffing much more than half the time that you're playing. If you're opening, like, let's say 25% of hands from the cutoff, which is not that unreasonable, you're bluffing like 40% of the time, or sorry, you're bluffing like 60% of the time there at least. And that's, again, totally fine, because your opponents are probably going to fold mistakenly with odds a lot. They're going to fold mistakenly when they could have otherwise won the pot by like 3-betting, for example, or something like that. And they're going to fold in spots where they just give you equity by not being aggressive with their hand otherwise. So if we really sort of boil it all down, and we'll sort of go through this over the course of this season with a lot of specific examples, but we have sort of unlimited opportunities to bluff, but we need to make sure that we don't get carried away, which is obviously super common. And the way that we do that is we make sure that when we are bluffing, that we fit either the classic definition, which is going to be the easiest one for us to understand, and these other three, and possibly some other ones that people may suggest. These other three ones here, which sort of will help guide us through the course of understanding what a good bluff is. Now, if we're going to talk about ranges quickly before we wrap up, you can say that it's one of the reasons why it's okay to, let's say, bluff with 2/3 of your hands and value bet with 1/3, to use arbitrary numbers, is that the value hands are so far ahead, usually, and the bluff hands are not always so far, the best bluff hands are not so far behind, that equity-wise it kind of shapes out that way. My example might be if you had, let's say, one combo of top set, which is winning like 95% of the time against a range, and two combos of straight draws, open-ended straight draws, which are winning 30% against a range, you could see that, like, you don't need to have them be 1-to-1 because the nut hand wins just so much more often that you could probably factor in a number of more bluffs and lower equity bluffs and things like that to find yourself kind of at an equilibrium point where you, like, the kind of equities average out to be about 50%. Now, this is, again, I'm talking in sort of anecdotal, vague numbers, but the reason what I'm trying to say is we can have lots and lots of spots to bluff. We just have to make sure that we manage the frequency in such a way that we don't take every opportunity to bluff, unless obviously we have some kind of amazing read or something like that. Okay. That is going to do it for this week's video. I will be back to do sort of march through the rest of this campaign. We'll talk about pre-flop, flop, turn, and river spots each week. Sort of move through the course of a hand structure, and look for opportunities that might be good bluffs or might be bad bluffs. And I know I posted it before in a thread about getting hand histories. If you have hand histories where you are bluffing, post those. Post the raw hand histories into that thread. Or into this comment thread here, post raw hand histories, or like converted somewhere where I can replay them on a replayer, like Weak Tight is a good one for that. And I will use your examples as much as I can to sort of walk through what a good bluff looks like and what a bad bluff looks like. So anyway, thank you guys for watching. This has been Good Bluff, Bad Bluff with me, Andrew BalugaWhale Sideman, only here on deucescrack.com. I will see you guys next time.